Hello, and welcome to today's Oslo Tropical Forest Forum webinar. My name is Frances Seymour, and I'm speaking to you today from a lovely spring day in Washington, D.C., where we just had a lovely pink sunrise. But I understand that it's snowing in Oslo, so I hope it's nice wherever you are. I think you'll be happy with your decision to join us today, as we have a rich program of speakers lined up to discuss very important topics related to Indigenous peoples. Before proceeding any further, let me say a word about the availability of interpretation in this session. In this plenary session, which is the first of two sessions during the webinar, we're being conducted in English, but you also have the choice of French or Spanish or Portuguese, and you can choose that by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. It has the shape of a small globe. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, please email the Medvind contact from the email that you received with your registration link. Now let me tell you a little bit about today's program. The issue of Indigenous peoples' rights was one of the key themes that we identified this time last year for the planned in-person conference in June of last year that, of course, we had to cancel. But it seems to me that everything that has happened in the world over the last year has made this set of issues even more important, especially in light of our heightened sensitivity to injustice and inequality, both of which have been revealed and exacerbated by the pandemic. So for that reason, the program committee of the Oslo Tropical Forest Forum is very grateful to colleagues at the Rainforest Foundation Norway who have taken the lead in organizing this webinar. As you will soon see, they have assembled an incredibly impressive group of speakers from across different communities, organizations, countries, and time zones. And we're grateful to all of the speakers that have come together today for their willingness to share their perspectives on all these issues. In this plenary session, we'll address why Indigenous peoples' rights are fundamental to the success of the next generation of conservation efforts, whether we're talking about a new global biodiversity framework or so-called nature-based solutions to climate change. And we'll discuss how international support can help ensure that Indigenous rights are integrated into those agendas. We'll have a presentation of a new analysis of just how much international donor funding has been going to Indigenous peoples and local communities to support their efforts to address issues of land tenure and forest management. That presentation will be followed by a panel of experts who will discuss how to improve and increase this funding. At the close of the plenary session, we will take a 15-minute break, and then we'll reconvene in 3 parallel sessions at 15:15 CET. Each of you should have received the link to the parallel session that you selected, but the links will also be posted in the chat function during this plenary. Each parallel session will explore the important role of Indigenous peoples in realizing and securing climate objectives, biodiversity objectives, and sustainable development objectives, but each one in a different setting. One parallel session will focus on forest protection in Peru through Indigenous self-governance as exemplified by the Wampas Nation. One parallel session will focus on Indigenous peoples' rights as key to increasing climate and development ambitions in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the third parallel session will focus on Indigenous peoples in the context of COVID recovery and building back greener and better with examples from Colombia and Brazil. Each parallel session will have interpretation available into one language other than English. So the session on Peru will have Spanish, the session on the DRC will have French, and the session on COVID-19 will have Portuguese. And in each of the parallel sessions, participants will have the option of posing questions through the Q&A function. And in case you're interested in more than one parallel session, as I am, the webinar will be recorded and available for viewing by sometime later next week. For the remainder of today's webinar, you'll be in the capable hands of various other moderators, starting off in this session with Anna Bjorndal. Anna is the Director of International Programs at Rainforest Foundation Norway. But first, to kick us off, I'm delighted to introduce Inger Andersen, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, to provide us with some opening remarks.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the Oslo Tropical Forest Forum. Last year has brought into sharp relief the deep interconnectedness between our health and the health of our planet through the COVID-19 pandemic, through growing climate impacts, through nature and biodiversity loss, through growing pollution and waste that is poisoning our planet and causing millions of premature deaths. Our money and technology-driven societies have forgotten that nature is essential to our existence. This is why calls to place a healthy natural world at the heart of our economies and societies are growing. But Indigenous peoples and local communities in all their diversity never forgot this basic principle. Through centuries of direct interaction with nature, they have held on to the belief of the oneness of life. They acknowledge that humanity is part of nature, not apart from or above it. Through this knowledge and through customary legal systems and cultures, Indigenous people are often best placed to conserve nature. As the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services found in its 2019 assessment, 28% of global land areas held by or managed by Indigenous peoples, and where land and marine resources are managed by Indigenous people and local communities, they are less impacted by human activity. This includes some of the most ecologically intact forests and biodiversity hotspots. Despite their track record of success, the lands of Indigenous peoples and local communities are under threat from extractive industries, from agriculture, from infrastructure, and so much more. And when Indigenous people and local communities try to protect the land, they too often pay for their efforts with their lives. Global Witness last year revealed that on average, 4 environmental defenders are killed per week. 4 every week. Almost half of these victims are Indigenous peoples and local communities. If we want to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, protect nature and the climate, and build a better future for all humanity, we need to stop attacking and start empowering Indigenous peoples and local communities. Today, I'd like to make a few points on how to make this happen. First, conservation efforts should prioritize the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. For all the reasons I've outlined, it makes absolute sense to return the reins to Indigenous people and local communities. This is the best way to effectively and sustainably manage nature. But it's also a matter of fairness, equity, and inclusiveness. At the moment, conservation efforts, like designation of protected areas, can lead to the displacement and exclusion of Indigenous peoples and local communities. This affects rights to food, to water, to culture, to livelihoods. At the same time, large concentrations of Indigenous peoples and local communities live in areas of the world projected to experience significant negative impacts of the three planetary crises: the climate crisis, the nature and biodiversity crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. Because of their dependency on nature, those communities will likely be hit hard. And secondly, the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities must be fully respected at the national level. These rights are firmly rooted in international laws and standards. They receive progressively more attention in the UN system, including a system-wide action to implement the UN Decade on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And yet, many countries do still not have complete legal frameworks that recognize Indigenous peoples' rights, or they don't have instruments and mechanisms to follow up on the respect of these rights, such as culturally appropriate grievance redress mechanisms or stakeholder engagement platforms. There have been victories. One such is the recent creation of a 1,600 square kilometer protected area in Panama, which came out as a result of a decision by the Supreme Court recognizing the indigenous nations' rights to these lands. But indigenous people too often had to fight tooth and nail to win these victories. UN Champions of the Earth for 2020, Nemonte Nquimo, for example, had to launch a legal battle to protect huge swaths of the Ecuadorian Amazon rainforest from oil companies. Now, thanks to her lawsuits, the Pastaza Provincial Court in 2019 protected 500,000 acres of Arani territory from exploitation. She has my utmost respect and admiration for winning this battle, but she shouldn't have had to fight it in the first place. And third, we need to ask Indigenous peoples and local communities to guide us as we reshape our economies and societies. Continuing to exclude Indigenous peoples and local communities from the global effort to fix the three planetary crises would be a monumental bad decision. Instead, we need to integrate them into global frameworks, starting with the pivotal meetings of the Rio Conventions of Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Desertification this year. We need to create more space and inclusive participatory spaces that support their participation into the official delegations to the COPs and to other processes. And we need to include Indigenous peoples into the recovery processes from COVID-19. And that means actively including Indigenous peoples and local communities in designing COVID-19 recovery and response measures. Friends, the planet is in trouble. We're in trouble. We need solutions. And the keepers of many of these solutions are Indigenous peoples and local communities. They're the ones who have the kind of relationship with nature to which our modern societies should aspire. We pay too little attention to their voices and their example for too long. Now is the moment to put Indigenous people and local communities and the valuable knowledge that they possess at the center of our attempts to fix a broken planet. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anna Bjørndal, and I'm the Director of International Programs here at the Rainforest Foundation Norway, and I will be leading all of us through the rest of this plenary session. I want to start off by thanking Inger Andersen for giving us this keynote speech, showing clearly that Indigenous peoples and local communities are important keepers to the solutions to our current biodiversity and climate crisis. Next speaker today is Jeffrey Hatcher. He is the Managing Director of Indofor North America, a forest consultancy company. Indofor North America has conducted a study for the Rainforest Foundation Norway that maps international donor funding for Indigenous peoples and local communities over the last 10 years. We have asked Jeffrey to present some of the key findings from his study. After his presentations, there will be some minutes for questions, so if you have some, please put these into the questions and answer mode at the end of the screen. I will pick up on the questions after his presentation. So Jeffrey, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm going to share this presentation. So thank you, Anna, and thank you to the Oslo Tropical Forest Forum for inviting us to present this recent study that we've completed for Rainforest Foundation Norway, and which will be released very soon. This morning, I'd like to present some of the key findings on the study that we completed on analyzing international donor funding for Indigenous peoples and local communities' tenure rights and forest management in tropical countries over the past decade. As Inger Andersen laid out very succinctly, there's strong evidence that Indigenous peoples and local communities with strong rights to manage forests contribute significantly to climate change mitigation and biodiversity. And it's with that rationale that Rainforest Foundation commissioned this study to analyze how much funding flows to this topic and to provide information for donor decision-making and prioritization leading up to the CBD and UNFCCC COPs. By way of background, this study is more detailed, and I'll be presenting just a few parts of the study today. We completed the study using an online survey of experts in the field of Indigenous peoples and local communities, land rights and forest management. But we also dug very deeply into the quantitative analysis of donor flows from bilateral, multilateral, and private foundation donors to the topic of Indigenous peoples, local communities, land tenure, and forest management. We use publicly available information on disbursements rather than commitments to understand really how much funding was flowing into projects related to this topic. We gathered more than 2.5 million transactions and filtered them by keywords and topics that we knew were relevant to this topic. In total, we accumulated about 10,300 relevant transactions that were dispersed to projects that supported Indigenous peoples, local community, tenure, and forest management capabilities through a variety of project types, including projects focused on Indigenous peoples and local communities' internal governance, territorial mapping, land tenure rights recognition, forest and land management capacity building, forest conservation area planning, community forest user groups, silviculture, forest monitoring, and many others. Noting that many of these projects are embedded in larger projects, we also went through the transactions to identify to the degree possible how much we're actually flowing to the ground and flowing to the direct activities rather than overhead costs. The first key finding is on the total disbursements to this topic over the past 10 years. And what we see is that over the past 10 years, an average of about $260 million has been dispersed to Indigenous peoples, local communities, tenure and forest management projects. When we isolated to understand how much was flowing to forest tenure rights recognition projects, we estimate the total to be around 11% of the total. When we tried to understand how many Indigenous peoples and local communities were involved in the projects, we estimated that about 25% of the total disbursements were in partnership with local community organizations. We also observed that there was no noticeable increase in donor disbursements after the Paris Agreement. And in order to put this in context, this amount of funding, about $2.6 billion over the past decade, is less than 1% of the total official development assistance dispersed for climate mitigation and adaptation. And another simple comparator is just to compare how much on an annual basis is dispersed to this topic compared to a large conservation organization. And so, for example, World Wildlife Fund's annual program expenses in 2020 exceeded the annual average of funds flowing to Indigenous peoples and local communities tenure and forest management. When we drill down to see where the funding is going, we see that Latin America received the largest share of funding in total, and on average was around $94 million per year, concentrated quite heavily in Brazil and Mexico. Africa was the second largest recipient of donor funding and received about $92 million per year, but it's more dispersed through a variety of countries, including quite a lot of focus in the Congo Basin. And Asia was the smallest recipient in total, receiving about $70 million per year, concentrated heavily in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Laos. And importantly, for the panel that follows, we tried to understand which donors were providing the most amount of funding to this topic. On this chart, you'll see on the left-hand side an aggregate total of all the funding. And what you'll notice is that foundation funders were some of the smallest funders. Multilateral institutions, which are channels for bilateral funding, were the largest source of disbursements. And bilateral donors making disbursements directly to universities or NGOs or United Nations agencies made up the rest of the share. What's important to note is that private foundations were singled out by survey respondents as some of the most influential donors to this topic, despite being the smallest donor. In particular, they make direct and flexible grants to Indigenous peoples' local communities more frequently than multilateral or bilateral donors. Multilateral institutions like the World Bank dispersed approximately $1.3 billion to this topic broadly. And they were some of the 80% of the funds actually 80% of the multilateral funds flowed through the World Bank. Considering the important role that Norway, Germany, and the United Kingdom play in this topic, we singled out these three donors to understand how much funding they provided to the sector. And you'll see they account for about a third of the total funding, But what's important to note that Norway, as a share of their total ODA, spent far more on this topic than other donors. And in fact, if Germany or the United Kingdom contributed the same amount of their ODA to this topic, we would have seen more than $2 billion in addition to those funds dispersed over the past decade. More than half of the funds flow through just 5 institutions, the large multilateral institutions. But beyond those institutions, the top 10 intermediaries for the largest donors include a mix of international NGOs, UN agencies, and consulting companies. It's important to note they don't flow directly, in large part, to Indigenous peoples and local community organizations. In order to understand a bit more in detail how the funding reaches the ground, we examined 3 funds: the Amazon Fund, the FCPF Readiness Fund, and the Tenure Facility. What you'll see in the Amazon Fund over the past decade is that approximately $191 million of the $1.4 billion committed to the fund flowed to Indigenous peoples and local communities' tenure and forest management. But just 16% of the total disbursements flowed directly to local organizations. The FCPF Readiness Fund, which has a mandate much larger than just Indigenous peoples and local communities, had a committed funding of about $400 million over the past decade. Of that committed funding, just 1% was dispersed to its Indigenous peoples and civil society capacity building program. And of the entire amount of FCPF disbursements, just 2% were made directly to Indigenous peoples organizations or civil society organizations. As a comparator, we focused on the International Land and Forest Tenure Facility. It's a new organization, and it was purposely built to channel funds from donors to Indigenous peoples and local communities to secure land tenure rights. And though smaller than the other funds, you'll notice that more than 75% of the project disbursements were to Indigenous peoples and local communities in the form of projects to secure land tenure rights. Qualitatively, the tenure facility is governed by a multi-stakeholder board, including Indigenous peoples representatives and local community representatives, and one of whom, Myrna Cunningham, will be on the panel that follows. And to finish the presentation this morning, I just took the one key finding that we think puts the rest of the funding statistics in context. And it's that the Rights and Resources Initiative estimates that scaling up tenure recognition in the 24 countries in the tropics that are ready for medium and large scale projects would require approximately $8 billion. But over the past decade, for the entire agenda of tenure and forest management, only 30% of that requirement has been dispersed. And if we focus on the land tenure projects, just 3% of that requirement was dispersed over the past decade. And so this clearly points to a gap that could be filled, or points to efforts that could be made to more effectively channel funds directly to the ground. So thank you very much to Rainforest Foundation Norway and to the Oslo Tropical Forest Forum for having us share this finding.
So thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that interesting presentation. We've received a couple of questions in the Q&A button, so I'm just going to start by giving you a couple of questions. One that I've been thinking about, which I'm curious to know from you. In your opinion, after having done this study, what do you think are the main barriers for an effective funding to Indigenous peoples and local communities? That's my question. And then there was a question in the Q&A pool, which says, there's a question on how this study communities and Indigenous peace, something about that. So I think we'll just start with those 2 issues.
Sure, Anna, you froze during the last question, but I'll start the response to the first question. So as part of the study, we did conduct a survey of experts in the field, representatives from donors and representatives from Indigenous peoples organizations. and asked specifically about the gaps and the barriers to funding. A lot of the barriers cited had to do with institutional capacity of recipient organizations, but there was also an observation by many respondents that over the past decade, there's been a lot of effort dedicated to improving capacity in terms of administrative and financial capability. But I think more broadly and qualitatively, it's the partnership aspect of engaging with Indigenous peoples and local communities, organizations, and aligning with their priorities. Organizations like the Tenure Facility or Rainforest Foundation Norway have built over many years trust with organizations, and that seems to be a key component in being successful in partnering with Indigenous peoples organizations for this type of activity. One of the other barriers has to do with simply the fact that Indigenous peoples have been excluded from policymaking over the past many years. And therefore, they are not frequently positioned to have a say in terms of large-scale project design and project implementation. I missed the last question, so if you could repeat it, or I can.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A on how this study, the one that you've done for RFN, aligns with similar efforts under local communities and Indigenous peoples platform at the UNFCCC. I don't know if you know the answer to that question.
Not sure I know the answer to that, but what I can say is I hope that the study provides some food for thought and some evidence base for decision making. It's not an easy thing to trace the financing flows to these projects. The information quality is not consistent and not always very good. So to the degree that we can provide some input to those additional analytical reports or studies, we'd be happy to do that. And I believe Rainforest Foundation Norway will be publishing this study shortly.
Great, thank you, Jeffrey. There was also a question on how much donor funds flow to Indonesia. Does it help Indigenous peoples or local communities to get legal rights over their land? Donors should revisit their funding strategy to make the outcome significant. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I would agree. In Asia, they were the largest recipient of donor funds in our study. A lot of the funds were embedded in bigger projects, and we are aware, of course, that there are NICFI grants, for example, to Amman, focused on securing land rights. But there's so much activity in terms of REDD+ and other initiatives to combat deforestation or combat palm oil expansion that potentially could be strengthened by including more work on land rights security. And so it is one of the largest recipients, but it is also one of the largest countries and has some of the most vulnerable rainforests on the planet. So that seems to align with that.
Great, thank you, Jeffrey. I'm happy you will continue with us and that we also now will enter a panel discussion based on your presentation. So thank you so much for presenting the key findings. And then we'll move on to the next agenda point today, which is a short panel discussion. We have until the hour for this panel discussion, and we've invited a group of experts who will discuss how we can increase international support to Indigenous peoples and local communities in their roles as stewards of the forest. Before I introduce the panel, I want to make sure that all of you know that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen that you can use. So please forward questions to the experts in the panel. And in the panel today, we have 3 people. They can just put on their camera when I start introducing them. First, I want to introduce Mirna Cunningham, who is a Miskita indigenous rights activist from Nicaragua. She is chair of the International Land Tenure Facility, and she's joining us from Nicaragua. Hello, Mirna. Then we have Chris Penrose Buckley, who is the Senior Land Policy Lead at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, one of the leading international donors supporting land rights programs. Hi, Chris. And then we have Kevin Curry, who is the CLUA Global Initiative Lead, as well as Program Officer with the Ford Foundation's Natural Resource and Climate Change team. So welcome to all of you. Good to see you. I will kickstart the debate by just asking you to briefly comment on the survey that we were just presented. And I'll start by asking maybe Chris and then Mirna and Kevin to give us their brief comments on what we've been presented so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. So I think two quick reactions to the Indifor study. I think firstly, as Jeff was saying, the data quality is not great. And so I think the first challenge, maybe particularly for donors, but also others, is to find better ways to measure this. I know in other sectors like nutrition, when things go up the agenda, often there's an effort to get better data. And so maybe there's a conversation with OECD DAC and others about how we can get more consistent ways of measuring what is going into this space. The second quick comment is there was obviously a big focus on funds that reach the ground. And I think that's a really important focus. Clearly, there's a need for more resource going to Indigenous people, local community action directly. But I think we also need to have a conversation about our overall theory of change and recognizing that we need to work at multiple levels. So we also need to be thinking, as Inge Andersen was saying, how do we work at the national level around national reform processes and also look at systemic change there. Thank you, Anna.
Hi, Anna. My reaction is, at least they're beginning to analyze the issue. So it means that we are moving from talking to acting on recognizing the role that Indigenous peoples plays in protecting forests, in reducing deforestation, and of course, in solving problems related with climate change. It's a shame that only 1 or 2% of the fund goes to Indigenous communities, because they are the ones that are doing the work and they have done it. That's why we have hotspots and that's why we have biodiversity. So I think this is an issue that has to be reviewed. Third, I think it's important to see that the private donors, although they are not the largest, they are supporting in a flexible way. And I think flexibility is an important aspect in supporting Indigenous peoples. And fourth, I'm so proud about the land tenure facility. 75% goes to Indigenous and local communities. And through only 5 years, we have been able to support titling of more than 2.4 million of hectares. We have been able to support the control of more than 11 million hectares, and we have been able to protect more than 2.4 million of hectares in 5 years, with 75% of resources going directly to Indigenous communities that build strong alliance with government and with local partners. So that is the solution.
I think there's 2 points that I take away from this excellent study. We need more funding and we need better funding. So more funding, $260 million a year represents a severe underinvestment relative to the extent and the severity of rights deprivation that's being experienced by communities, but also relative to the magnitude of the impact that recognizing those rights could have on global challenges. I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, local communities, we're talking about 2.5 billion people who claim customary rights over 50% of the world's land area. And we know, thanks to the Rights and Resources Initiative, that there are 790 million hectares of claimed but not yet legally recognized land in low and middle income countries. That's more than 25 times the area of Norway. So we're talking about an enormous challenge and affecting an enormous number of people, and yet the budget of one conservation organization is larger than the annual finance for this issue. We know that well-organized, well-resourced, tenure-secure communities can have a major impact on slashing deforestation. We know that these communities are managing an enormous carbon stock. The carbon in their lands and forests 4 times larger than total annual emissions from all sources. We know that they're making an enormous contribution to biodiversity conservation, 80% of biodiversity on indigenous lands. And we've learned, thanks to recent analysis by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that management by communities is also making a contribution to reducing the risk of future pandemics. And they say very clearly in their latest report on biodiversity and pandemics that tenure security is a major enabling condition that makes the success of pandemic prevention programs work. So given the contribution that tenure security is making to all of these global challenges, 260 million is far too small. Secondly, we need better funding. And I was disheartened to see that only 25% of the projects identified have developed real partnerships with Indigenous peoples. That's far too small. Indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendants need to be at the center, and it's their organizations that should be receiving the funding and designing the programming. I also think there needs to be more of a deliberate focus on tenure security itself. We saw that only 11% of the projects mentioned that as the primary focus. Obviously, other kinds of forest management activities are critical, but tenure security is the enabling condition that allows for the success of broader funding in this area. So I'd really like to see more focus on that. And I think, as Mirna mentioned, there's a lot of new innovation like the tenure facility in this space that has the potential to change the trends that we're seeing.
So thank you for those remarks from all of you. I think it's very interesting. I agree, too little, and it's not really reaching out. No, so let's start. I have a couple of questions prepared for each of you, and then we'll open up also the floor from the audience. No, Chris, you represent UK, no, a major donor to this agenda, and you're hosting the COP26. The presidency is lifting the importance of nature-based solutions. How do you see Indigenous peoples and local communities' tenure rights fit into your thinking about nature-based solutions and the funding? How do you see the future of this?
Yeah, great, thank you, Anna. A really good question. I think the first point is that we recognize that the evidence is increasingly clear that recognition and protection of the tenure rights of Indigenous and peoples and local communities is an essential requirement. It's a foundation for nature-based solutions and for progress on climate reducing emissions. So put it the other way, we're not going to make progress globally on these big challenges if we cannot make progress on recognizing tenure rights legally, but also in practice. I think this is reflected in very clearly in a number of work streams under our nature campaign. That the Leaders Pledge for Nature that was launched last year makes an explicit reference to the recognition of Indigenous people and local community rights. And it's also a key part of thinking around sustainable agriculture and forest and commodity chains in our nature campaign. So I think that the recognition is there. I think the challenge we and other partners globally are grappling with at the moment is how do we move from recognition to action, right? And clearly the gap in terms of funding and action is still great. And so I think there's 3 particular things I would like to highlight that we are really focusing on and thinking about and talking to other partners. And it'd be great to see some kind of clearer commitment around these this year. The first one is funding. And I think it's important not just to focus on funding. Funding clearly is really important, but there are other things as well. On 2 quick points on funding, I think the first one is that as the India4 study showed, I mean, there was a lot of money in the system already, which isn't going to the right places. Of course, these big multilateral funds, we know they're not always the most efficient ways of distributing money down to the grassroots level. Nonetheless, there is a lot of resource there, and it's part of their mandate, even if it's not the only or main focus. So how can we work better with multilaterals to support more money going down to the grassroots level action? The second point I would make is that, and this picks up my point earlier, is that I think we have to look at a number of different entry points. How can we also work around national level reform? The Indifor study looked at particular Indigenous people, local community tenure rights and forest management, but you could sort of add a national level reform dimension to that as well, which I think is really important, both to protect and sustain any gains made at the local level. And that brings me to my second point, which is around coordination, which is not a very exciting topic, but I think really important. I sit, I guess, in the more traditional land sector, looking at national land policy reform, and there's a huge amount of expertise and capacity about how to drive systemic change in policy, in systems. And I think somehow an opportunity this year is to marry together the land sector work with the forest tenure work and see how we can drive better change, mobilize multilateral, bilateral, and local action in a more effective way. And that requires both national and local level coordination. And then my last point, just to conclude, is around power and politics. I think often in the land sectors, certainly in the more traditional land sector, this is approached in a more technical way. That's certainly not true of the work on forests, where rights, I think quite rightly, is really central. But I think however much we focus on tenure rights, unless we change the incentives that drive deforestation, that drive rights violations, clearly we are not going to make progress. So tenure rights is important. It's no silver bullet, as we know, but somehow we need to get a better grip on the political incentives and economy of land recognition and deforestation to kind of sustain this over time. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And adding the limitation of time also, no, to do all this. We've received several questions now, and I'm going to address one to you, Kevin. There's been several questions on how to interpret the rather small percentage of funding flowing to Indigenous people organizations in countries. Is it a question of capacity, political willingness, others? Could you comment on that?
I think it's a problem of perception, and it's a problem of plumbing. In terms of perception, I think there is still a lingering perception that it's somehow more difficult to work with Indigenous or local communities than other kinds of constituencies or organizations. What we find in the Ford Foundation is that's just not true. Certainly Indigenous and community grassroots organizations do need to build their capacity, and they need support to do that, but so do every other kind of organization. Every organization has its unique capacity building challenges. In terms of plumbing, what I would say is that this is a systemic problem in climate finance. We know that only 10% of international climate finance reaches the ground, including local governments. And we've seen now from this study that hardly any of that is going to communities. But part of the barrier has been that there haven't been efficient mechanisms for channeling that funding. And so it's had to be highly intermediated. I think what we're starting to see now is that Indigenous peoples and local communities are helping to create new and better intermediaries with a complete and total focus on this issue, like the Tenure facility. But they're also creating their own locally controlled funds, like the DEMA fund in Brazil, that are able to access international climate finance directly and have the systems to manage that efficiently. The flip side of that is that there's too much money that's stuck in the wrong places. And we've seen from this analysis, I mean, it's unconscionable to me how much money is stuck in the World Bank and the FCPF. Why can't that reach the ground, given the severity and urgency of the challenge? So I think there's a misalignment there. The last thing I would say is that we know that investment in this issue is effective, and we know that it's cost effective relative to other interventions for climate or biodiversity or public health. But cost effective doesn't mean cheap, and we have to be willing to pay up. Indigenous peoples and communities have been doing this work that benefits all of us for free. And now we need to invest in their efforts.
Thank you, Kevin. Mirna, I received also a question for you. What do you think that can be done to minimize donor compliance standards, which is a challenge for Indigenous peoples and local community organizations to receive funds directly? How can we do something about that?
I think the first thing we have to do is to change the mind. It's a problem of mindset. As Kevin mentioned, there's a perception that Indigenous peoples and local communities do not have capacity. But what is behind that perception? Of course, this is a problem of racism and the way in which colonialism made us believe that there are people that are inferior and do not have capacity. And we have proved through different studies that Indigenous peoples do have capacity. We do have knowledge system. We have management system of natural resources of territories. So I think the first thing that we need is to continue working very strong on changing this mindset. The second thing is that we need to identify those organizations, those mechanisms that are being created between Indigenous peoples and other stakeholders. We are building alliances like the Tenure facility that we are working together. We're bringing private sector, we are bringing NGOs together with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and we are trying to establish a mechanism that takes resources directly to communities. So we need to identify those different institutions. And third, we need to continue working together with local communities, with Indigenous communities for this exchange of knowledge. I do not call it capacity building. It's not a problem of someone coming from outside teaching Indigenous communities how to administrate, how to work. It's a mutual learning process, and we have to support that kind of things. The support that goes for tenure security goes for a lot of different areas, from titling, from registration, from legal aspect, from forestry management plan, but it also goes to governance, and governance means working together to create an environment in which each sector has an important role to play. And of course, in that, the international standards on human rights are important. The national legislation is important, but also the customary law, the customary practices, the traditional knowledges of Indigenous peoples are aspects that has to be considered. So I do believe that we are in an important moment of history in which Indigenous peoples have proven that we can play a role to advance in solving the problems of climate change. And tenure security is one important aspect. So I do believe that we need to change our mind, and let's work together. Let's begin to see that if we do not join hands and work together, it's impossible to advance.
Thank you, Mirna. The questions are flowing in. That's great. I have one now, I think, for Kevin, or maybe Chris also, you want to comment. We know that a lot of the processes include securing land tenure, organizational strengthening, building trust, things that take time. How can we push for longer term support instead of year by year funding, Kevin?
It's definitely an important challenge, and there's no question that it takes time to build trust with Indigenous peoples and local communities. We shouldn't overstate how simple it is to secure tenure, right? It actually is quite a complex process. It does take time to manage conflicts, to get the enabling conditions right. But I think the reality is that it can actually happen much faster than we often envision. And as Mirna shared, some of the results from the Tenure facility just in its first few years of operation are really encouraging. That showing that work on the front end to get the right design and the right mechanisms of implementation can lead to pretty rapid results that scale up very quickly. Certainly in the Ford Foundation and in a lot of philanthropies, the trend is towards longer term funding, towards more flexible and general support. And I think that's essential to enable organizations to have impact and to be able to invest in organizations because you believe in their mission and trust that they know the best way to deliver on that mission. And I hope that that trend will extend to other funders as well.
Thank you, Kevin. I have for Chris. Chris, to what extent is the window of forest or nature-focused funding to IP organizations, communities, and individuals limiting the potential effectiveness of this funding? Do you think, should donors and development banks be investing in a broader scope of activities, such as health and infrastructure, in light of the pandemic and a need to build more resilient economies?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, of course, all these things matter, right? And so particularly as the world kind of responds to the pandemic and economies recover, of course, there's a long list of priorities. I think that despite that, I think there's no doubt that there needs to be much greater investment and focus on tenure rights for Indigenous people and local communities. I think the risk is that things get spread far and wide. I mean, one of the challenges with some of the big multilateral funds already is that they have a long list of priorities. And it's obviously a fairly bureaucratic process. And so it's actually in the end, very little actually goes down to where it needs to go. I mean, I would agree with that point insofar as picking up my point earlier that I think we need to think about interventions at the national and at the local level and how they come together. I think the Tenure facility has shown that actually it's not the bottleneck is not capacity and community groups. There's a lot more that could be channeled through the Tenure facility and similar mechanisms. So yes, all these things matter, but I don't think that should take away from the fact that we have a strategic opportunity to really scale up resourcing to this, and then also to bring together what happens at the national level. Just coming back to the previous point about time, I think yes, these things do take time, particularly if you're looking at national recognition and the kind of policy process, legislation. I mean, that can take a number of parliamentary cycles in many countries. Nonetheless, if we can link together what, for example, the World Bank is doing at the national level around land reform and what bilaterals are supporting with local level action and bring that together in a more effective way, then I think we will make progress a lot faster. And I think that's where we're missing a trick at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So Kevin and Mirna, we have now one of the major donors involved here, represented by Chris. Do you think that, UK or how do we get other like-minded donors on the agenda? How can we get other donors on board?
I think we have to continue generating evidence, information of what we are doing and how we are really being able to deliver at local and levels when we have the resources, like what we have been doing from the Tenure facility. We need to generate more evidence from Indigenous communities to prove that what we are saying is true. And we need to create platforms in which we can have dialogues. We can share information with these major donors. And that means that we need Indigenous peoples and local community members participating in these global events, in where they can bring their voices and where they can present what they're doing. And I think these are the only possibilities to really influence the donors.
I know Chris, and I know Chris has been a champion for this issue, and I was very encouraged to hear the priorities that he laid out, which I fully agree with. I think COP26 is going to be a critical moment for this agenda. I would say there are a couple of things that need to happen around the COP. One, it would be great to have a new commitment to funding for this issue, which brings together bilateral donors and might also bring together some philanthropic organizations to boost this number. I mean, let's quadruple this level of funding at a minimum. Secondly, I think coordination across actors is really important, both the donors for this agenda, but also the key organizations on the ground, including Indigenous organizations who are getting the work done. That would be great. Third thing is, let's make sure that the discussion of nature-based solutions at the COP has Indigenous peoples and communities and their tenure security as a primary area of focus. And fourth, we need to make sure that Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, local communities have a voice and a presence in the COP negotiations themselves.
So I really want to continue this discussion. I have many more questions, and there's lots of questions. And unfortunately, we have to stop now. But we just talked that we would assemble all the questions and that we will actually send them to all of you and see to what extent we can manage to also answer them. So unfortunately, this panel discussion has come to an end. I want to round off by saying thank you to all of you. The task ahead is enormous and we have little time, and we have some facts now on the table and we need to scale up. So thank you for sharing, your views on how we actually can do this. We'll have a short break now before the parallel sessions start at 1:15. The parallel sessions will also be interpreted. Participants have all received a link to their chosen parallel session. The links will also be posted in the chat, and you can click on the link when it's posted, as this webinar room will soon close in a couple of minutes. So again, thanks to all the speakers, to all of you for your contributions, and good luck in the parallel sessions. Goodbye.